To repeat, I'm going to talk about my ancestors, the Sutton family, the first real settlers of the Noggles Road farmstead after the indigenous people. We begin first with the pioneers. Richard Sutton, 1812 to 1884, and this is a picture of Richard Sutton that was taken in the mid-1850s when he was in his 40s. And his fifth wife, Ann Matthews Sutton, who was born in 1837 and lived till 1910. Now I'm going to give a little backstory. Some of you have heard this before from our previous talks, but a little backstory on Richard as to why this individual ended up in Iron Creek area. Richard Sutton was born in Lincolnshire, England, and immigrated to the United States in 1831, settling first in New Jersey, and then he shortly thereafter came to Michigan. He had some education and became a minister, first under the Methodist Episcopal Church and then as a Free Methodist of the Wesleyan variety. He was known as a Methodist exhorter. And the singular fact about Richard Sutton was that he was married 5 times and he sired 14 children, 10 of whom lived to adulthood. Now his first 2 wives died from complications of childbirth, which left him with 4 young children. He and his 3rd wife had no children of their own, and Richard was married to wife number 3 when he decided to travel by wagon train from Argentine, Michigan, which is on the Genesee-Shiawassee County border, to California to search for gold or wealth in March of 1853. His journey took 7 months, and he chronicled his travels in letters to his family. He wrote letters almost every day, and these letters were saved by family members and transcribed into 2 versions by subsequent generations. Now, when Richard was in California, he settled near the community of Wairika, which is in the area of Mount Shasta. And he did some mining, he preached in a storefront church, he worked at odd jobs and supervised his brother-in-law William Chamberlain's farm. He also traveled up into Oregon Territory, preaching to the miners there. Now, while he was in California, his 3rd wife, Sarah Chamberlain, died. She was back in Michigan, but she passed away from illness. And Richard learned about her death several months after the fact, and feeling grief-stricken and vulnerable, he meets up with a woman by the name of Sister Houghton, whom he marries in June of 1855. Richard comes to find out that Sister Houghton is not who she said she was. Her first husband shows up upon the scene, having been recently released from prison, and files a bigamy action against Richard and Sister Houghton. 2 separate trials were held, and both Sister Houghton and Richard are found not guilty, as the claimant presented no proof of his marriage to Sister Houghton. So at the onset of all this travail, Richard separates from wife number 4 and has the marriage annulled. These proceedings and wife number 4's shenanigans leave Richard with just enough money to book passage around Cape Horn and return to his family, now living in Leone Township in Jackson County, Michigan, and his children were attending what was then known as the Leone Institute. The Leone Institute later merged and became Adrian College. After reuniting with his children in 1856, Richard then meets a young woman from the Irish Hills area named Ann Matthews. Sparks flew, and Ann becomes Richard's 5th wife. The exact date of the marriage is unknown, but in all likelihood it occurred in 1857. Ann was 25 years younger than Richard, and her family, specifically her brother George Matthews, provided Ann with a parcel which became this property on Noggles Road. And when it was deeded to Ann, it was deeded to Ann, not to Richard, but deeded to Ann Sutton from her brother, George Matthews, in December of 1857. And at the time of this transaction, this section of Noggles Road was in a virtually virgin state. Ann and Richard built the farmhouse 1858, 1859, 1860, in those years, and proceeded to raise their family there. That brings us to the second generation of Suttons. And you see this photo here. This was taken in 1884. This was shortly after Richard Sutton's death, and it's the only picture that I have of Ann Matthews Sutton. She's about 47 years old. She's in the middle of that picture, and she's surrounded by 4 of her sons and her youngest daughter, Charlotte. Let's see.
These are all her children?
Pardon?
They're all her children?
They're all her children, because Richard and Ann had 7 children. Mary Kay Sutton Hawley. Anybody know about the Hawleys from Napoleon? She's in that family. She was born in 1858. She died very young in 1888. George Matthews Sutton, who is named after Ann's brother, was born in 1860, and he lived till 1934. James Nolan Sutton, one of the signatories to the deed between George and Ann, but they named their 3rd son after him, James Nolan Sutton. Unfortunately, James only lived a year, or less than a year. He died in 1864. They had Benjamin Green Sutton that was born in 1865, and he lived till 1927. And then their 5th child, they named Richard Grant Sutton. He was born in 1868, and he lived till 1937. But when Richard Grant was born, Richard was still alive, so they called Richard Grant, Grant. And Grant he became for the rest of his life. The youngest son was named Henry Dan Sutton. He was born in 1871, and he lived till 1894. And the youngest, the little girl in the picture, is Charlotte Lottie Sutton Bowens. And she was born in 1874, and she died in 1956. So life at the farmstead remained very primitive into the 1870s and 1880s. Cousin Jessie Allen's memoir, written in 1947 when she was in her 80s, recounts her early travels to the Iron Creek area. At that time, Noggles Road was a corduroy road with logs sunk crosswise across Iron Creek. Richard plowed his fields with a team of oxen and wore a yoke himself to feed his farm animals. Cooking was still done over the fireplace or in a Dutch oven. The bedsteads were corded with straw or corn husks in the summer and added a feather tick in the winter. Lighting was by candlelight, later kerosene lamps. Then the local schoolhouse, the Nichols School on Wellwood Road, the schoolhouse no longer exists, it's a residence, but the Nichols School on Wellwoods Road served as both a school for 2 generations of Suttons and a community meeting place. And Elder Sutton often preached there. Now, farming this acreage was difficult, to say the least. The soil was thin and rocky, and with low-lying areas marsh-like. Nevertheless, Richard Sutton continued to farm until his death in November of 1884. He was 72 years old. George Matthews Sutton had his own farmstead on English Road. Benjamin Green Sutton was a student at Adrian College, and Grant and Henry Dan remained at home. In 1891 to 1892, Henry Dan left for Washington State, settling near his half-brother, Edward Barak Sutton, who was a Presbyterian minister in Seattle. Henry Dan had a very unfortunate time out in Seattle and subsequently committed suicide on Whidbey Island in Puget Sound in 1894. So his short life ended then. So that left Grant Sutton on the family farmstead. And then we get to the 3rd generation, which is the family of Grant and Jenny Sutton. You see here, this is the wedding photo of Jenny Bowen Sutton and Grant Sutton. They were married on Christmas Day in 1889 in Canada. They had 4 children. Viva P. Sutton, who died in 1891, she was only 12 weeks old. Hazel Gertrude Sutton Olber was born in 1892 and lived till 1968. Harry Grant Sutton was born in 1894 and died in 1979. And the youngest daughter, Edith Charlotte Sutton Fielder, was born in 1898, and she lived till 1918. This picture that I assume is approximately 1915 was the last family photograph of the Grant Sutton family. It shows Edith on the left in the back, Harry in the middle. And if anyone knew my grandfather, that's a pretty amazing picture because he had hair in that picture. Most of his life he was very, very bald. And then his sister to the right is Hazel. There's Grant in front and his wife Jenny. And let's see where we are. And farming remained a constant struggle from 1884 to 1937. The Sutton family scratched out what can only be called a subsistence living from their acreage. They raised potatoes, garden vegetables, as well as small amounts of wheat and corn. The family did remain active in the tight-knit Iron Creek community, and the family highly prized education, with Harry and Edith both attending Manchester High School and boarding in town during the winter months. Harry graduated in 1912 and Edith in 1915. Hazel lost her opportunity to attend high school when she was sent to Canada at the age of 14 to nurse an ailing Bowen's relative. But Harry Grant was not a farmer at heart, and his father did not require that he stay on the farm. Harry's first real job was that of schoolmaster in the Columbia School District in Jackson County. Hazel married farmer Fred Alber and moved to Sharon Township, where she became a farm wife. She and Fred had 5 children, 2 sons and 3 daughters, and their descendants, many of which still live in this area. Edith married Manchester Township farmer Fred Fielder in 1917. However, tragically, Edith died in childbirth in 1918 at the age of 20, and her baby daughter died as well. Harry was married twice. His first marriage in 1915 ended after the tragic death of his infant son in 1916. And subsequent to his divorce, he entered the Army, taught school, became a traveling salesman before he landed a job as a rural mail carrier with the United States Post Office in Manchester in 1924. Harry's second marriage to Fern Caroline Paya in November of 1920 was a happy one. He and Fern went on to have 2 sons, one of whom, Hugh Richard Sutton, was my father. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt, but during that time, was his sole income farming, or did he have a job? Did Grant Sutton have other means of income?
He only the farm. So that's why I'm saying this is hand to mouth. He did not work in a factory or anything like that. And he realized the limitations of farming at this time, and he did not, tell Harry, you need to stay here and farm. Harry wasn't going to anyway, because Harry had a mind of his own, but he was not going to do it. But this was not a profitable operation anymore. It became even less so. As Sybil noted, in the years between 1930 and 1937, this area was hit by a very severe drought, and the farmland looked really dried up. So his last years were not very productive ones on the farm, unfortunately. But they stayed and remained on, Grant and Jenny remained on the farmstead until Grant's death in 1937 at the age of 69. The farm was operated with 19th century equipment. The farmstead had no electricity and no indoor plumbing. Grant Sutton never owned a tractor. After Grant's death, Hazel and Harry moved their widowed mother to the village of Manchester, where she resided next to Harry until her death in 1942. 1937 to 1948 marked what Sybil has already indicated, the first period of decline at the Noggles Road homestead. Jenny Sutton attempted to sell the property via land contract in December of 1940 to one Anthony Erda of Detroit. But following Jenny's death, Mr. Erda transferred his interest in the property back to Hazel Alber and Harry Sutton. So eventually, Hazel and Harry were able to sell the property to a Mr. Manley in 1947. And after owning the farmstead for approximately 1 year, Mr. Manley sold the property to an electrician from Detroit named Louis Kolongowski. And that ends the Sutton saga at the Noggles Room Farm.